Hi everyone, and welcome to Compliance Panel's live webinar. And I'm David, your host today. And on behalf of Compliance Panel's team, I would like to thank you for being part of this event. Now, the topic for today's presentation is FDA requirements for device labeling, development, contents, distribution, and changes. Now, today's speaker is Jeff Kissoff. Now, Jeff has been involved in label control since 1986, and over the time, he has developed and approved labeling for Class 1, 2, and 3 devices. His direct interaction with FDA in this area has educated him in the requirements and expectations with regard to changes to labeling. We are really honored to have such a notable and knowledgeable person such as Mr. Kissoff with us to present this webinar. Now, before we begin, I would like to inform you of the program outline for this webinar. This event is for 60 minutes duration. First, Mr. Kissoff will take you through today's webinar, highlighting the areas that will be covered, and he will then share with you his presentation. Now, for the purpose of avoiding discontinuity, we request all to hold back your questions until the Q&A window begins. 10 minutes of time will be allotted for the Q&A, during which your questions will be answered. Now, if for any reason you get logged out of this training session or teleconference, please follow the same procedure to join in again. Now that we're all ready to start, I request Mr. Kissoff to take it from here. Jeff?
Thanks very much for the intro, David. Let me welcome everybody for coming to the webinar. And I like webinars a lot. I like presenting them. I miss the face-to-face interaction, but my Q&A sessions are more discussions, depending on what the attendees want. Could be less Q&A sessions. Labeling is an area of regulatory concern that, I'm going to be blunt with you, there's no mnemonics that can help you here. There's no streamlined system that I can recommend to you. Labeling is very cut and dry. There are regulations. You must follow them. There are certainly certain ways to follow them more easily than not. Education of all your in-house personnel, sales, for example, is a good way. But absent that, I'm just going to cover the presentation. Labeling is a relatively dry area. I'll try to enlighten it with some examples and some explanations as I go along. But again, if there are any questions at the end, I wholeheartedly encourage you to ask them. The outline of today's presentation is going to start with what is labeling, what does it mean, what constitutes labeling. I'll define misbranding. I'll continue on to false representation, misleading statements, objectionable labeling, and then I'm going to cover briefly the regulatory requirements and also include what types of labeling, well, it's not really labeling, of course, is exempt from FDA requirements. What are the labeling requirements for over-the-counter devices? I want to cover that for a few minutes. They're a little different than devices that are sold directly through to medical professionals. The QSR labeling requirements, what's in the quality systems regulation. Sequence of labeling control, a sequence from your company of what you're going to do when you issue labels and print them, things like that. General labeling requirements. Then specifically sterile device labeling. After that, I'm going to cover labeling changes. What happens when you want to change the labeling? Do you have to inform the FDA? What kind of label control you need to have in your company? If there are any CE implications, I do want to cover those briefly, and other implications. There's always an other in every presentation. Just want to cover that briefly. To start, what is labeling? I mean, the whole gist of this webinar is labeling control and issuing labeling and covering it and what the FDA regulations are. Before you start that, though, you need to know what constitutes labeling. And Section 201M of the QSR, not so much the QSR, but of the Federal Device, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, says that what labeling is it's all labeling. It's everything that's written that either is on the device or any of its containers or packaging. That is the same thing as on the device. Or something that goes with the device after it's shipped. Package insert. That's not on a device, but it's considered labeling. The definition of accompanying is something I do want to cover here. It's more than just a physical association with the product. It doesn't have to be connected to it. It could be posters, tags, pamphlets, circulars, everything that's listed here, instructions, directions. It also includes labeling that's brought together with the device after shipment. If you ship your, let's say, instrumentation system, and when your in-service personnel get to the facility and they set it up, they're going to leave something with the instrument, a cheat sheet on how to use it. That's considered labeling, even though it has not been shipped with the product. It ends up accompanying the product. Therefore, it is labeling. advertising is very interesting as far as whether it constitutes labeling. And the appellate courts have held, and it's very rare in my presentations, for those of you who have attended them, I don't usually put quotations in my device. I find they're really confusing, misleading. Having said that, though, I think it's important here what the appellate courts have found, and pretty much, as far as the courts are concerned, most advertising is labeling. And the courts say that the term labeling is defined in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act as including all printed matter accompanying any article. So advertising does accompany the article in the loosest sense of the term as far as the courts are concerned, and therefore constitutes labeling. So your advertising must be under the same type of change control as your labels that go on your pouch product, for example. Misbranding is very important. And what it is you need to determine whether your device has any of the following characteristics. If it does, it's misbranded, and then its labeling is considered to be false or misleading, and you will be cited by the FDA for misbranded labeling. Depending on the nature of the misbranding, if you've committed to perhaps correct it quickly, or maybe as part of FDA inspection they've noticed it and you've worked with them, the sanctions may be less severe. However, misbranding is not, when I say that misbranding means false or misleading, it's not limited to false. It could be misleading. It could be true in the strict sense of the word, but the labeling might be deemed by the FDA to be violative if it's deceptive to the customer. And that gels more with over-the-counter things. The FDA, in the FDA's position, medical professionals have a higher level of understanding when it comes to this area than does the layperson. Talking about misleading, to continue, labeling is deceptive if, in the mind of the reader, it creates a false impression. Certainly a false statement, but misdirection, ambiguity, anything like that. The FDA really comes down hard on labeling that they interpret to be misleading. So my advice to you is make sure that all of your labeling is not misleading. If it's a prescription device, show it to some of the medical professionals to whom you're going to sell. Ask what their opinion. Ask if they understand it. If it's over the counter, do a quick public, a quick and dirty, I guess, no pun intended, public evaluation. Do you know what this means? Things like that at trade shows, for example. To continue, a device is misbranded if its labeling does not contain the name of your company, the place of business or of your company, or packer or distributor, whichever is applicable. Now, when it comes to place of business, all you need to do is the classic definition, unofficial definition, of course, is the classic practice is if you can locate the company and let them know that there's a problem with their device based on the information on the labeling. So my company's name is LifeTech. If it just said the product just said LifeTech Incorporated on it, the FDA would likely judge that that's insufficient and the device is misbranded. But if it gives our name and perhaps our website, that's something that could be located, or our town, Houston, Texas, for example. That's going to be sufficient to identify your company. Your labeling has to tell how many pieces are in that container. If it's a sterile disposable, it'll be 1. Non-sterile disposable could be a large quantity. Instrumentation, multiples, things like that. You have to have a quantity of the contents on the labeling. A device is misbranded if the required wording is not prominently displayed. It's written in like 2 font, for example, or clearly stated, really vague. As we go on the presentation, I'll tell you what wording is required depending on the nature of the device. Continuing misbranding, if the labeling doesn't have directions for use, adequate directions for use, the product is considered to be misbranded. Now, of course, realize that adequate instructions for use from the perspective of the medical professional, the physician or the clinician, is going to be much easier to meet that standard than it will be if it's an over-the-counter device, in which case you really need to write for the layperson. Also, if what warnings are required must be on there. If it's sanction, if your device is not to be used by children, that must be on there. Any unsafe dosages, meaning recommended dosages, administration, application, etc. And if your device is misbranded if, as it's recommended in your labeling, your device is dangerous to someone's health, and you have not warned against that. Like the example I gave momentarily for children, pregnant women, another good example there. False representation means it's not something that the FDA can put their fingers on and say this is inaccurate. However, incorrectness, inadequacy, incompleteness is there. Unsubstantiated claims of therapeutic value is you want to make sure that the indications for use, for example, are consistent between your device 510K or PMA and also what's on the labeling. Any inaccuracies that are on there. Substitution of parts or materials, something that's not listed on the labeling. Everything that's listed on the labeling must be in the device and vice versa. Any sort of suggestion of government approval or endorsement approved by U.S. Food and Drug Administration cannot appear on the labeling of your product. Misleading statements are, trade puffery is the best way to put that. And what that is things that everything that's on your labeling must be able to be substantiated. That's the easiest way to think about misleading statements. Any sort of opinion or subjective statements, they can't be substantiated. Any sort of information that your company is aware of, material facts or consequences that may result from use, or if there's an existence of difference of opinion. Again, opinion, subjective statements, trade puffery, false or misleading statement with regard to another device. These are all things that you don't want on your labeling at all. Your labeling should only consist of facts, material facts that can be verified by looking at your packaging, looking at the device inside your packaging, excuse me. Objectionable labeling is another step forward. This is something that the FDA will not want to see at all. Any pictorial representations that do not accurately reflect the device. Any testimonials that are misleading. Any list of parts or components that may be in contrast to what's inside the package. Any sort of brand or trade names instead of established names. The thing I can think of here is that if you're selling ibuprofen, make sure it says ibuprofen and doesn't refer to any other brand or trade name. I want to cover regulatory requirements right now. The name and place of business must be on your labeling. It has to be conspicuously displayed, large, in a spot where it's going to be seen most easily, not hidden. This is all about intent. Make sure your company's intent is to primarily have where your company's location is. Other interesting things that I find people ask me at my presentations of in-person seminars of this topic. Your corporation name can be preceded or followed by a particular division if you want. Abbreviations may be used. You don't have to use the word the. Like I said before, street address. Street address may be omitted if it's in a directory. So if I'm going to have my company's name, what I'm going to do is make sure it has its name and Houston, Texas. The fact that it's in a directory doesn't mean that I can just write LifeTech Incorporated and leave it at that. The intent here is that the individual know which directory to go to. Now, of course, you could say, well, hey, you know what? If you put LifeTech Incorporated on the internet, you could find where it is. That's true, but the FDA still has not allowed that type of description to be on the packaging. City, state, zip code must be on there. Continuing name and place of business. In situations, a device might not be manufactured by a company that appears on the label. In a case like this, the label must reveal the connection. It's got to say something like manufactured for or distributed by. Either of these is acceptable. Both of them is acceptable. You've got to indicate this on your labeling. And this is, if you're the company that does not do the manufacturing, this is less regulatory and more liability perspective. Sometimes a company will drop ship something. If you're a company that has something made entirely for you overseas, and it's a large, heavy object. And the reason you have it made overseas is for two reasons: cost and ease of shipment to overseas customers. That's called a drop shipment. Your company specifies what's going to be in the package, but they never see it. In this particular case, the labeling can state your company's business instead of the people that manufacture it for you, because you, even though you have very little to do with the actual assembly or even manufacture of the device, you are in fact the manufacturer, and your name should appear on the labeling. From an intended use perspective, if a packer or distributor or seller, somebody who doesn't manufacture the device, labeling has to be on there to include any new intended use. And what this covers in many cases is reprocessing of single-use devices. Continuing on, if you're a manufacturer and you know or you have information indicating that your device is going to be used for a purpose other than its labeled intended use, you must label it to include those other uses. Now, what this means is that if you have a physician tell one of your salespeople, hey, I'm using this anesthesia device for cardiovascular purposes, it's incumbent upon your company to take a look at that and evaluate whether that physician is actually doing that. Are they doing it on an ongoing basis? To what extent are they doing that? It's your responsibility to see how widespread that practice is as well. And if it's widespread enough, you're going to need to modify your labeling to include this. Directions for use must be on the label. And what this means is directions for use under which a layman can use a device safely for its intended use. What has to be included here is the purpose for which and the conditions under which the device can be used. What is it used to treat? Quantity of dose for each use, and quantities for persons for different ages or physical conditions, weight, child, adult, elderly, etc. Frequency of administration, how often, and duration, how long. Sometimes those are similar, sometimes those are different. Whichever one applies must be on your directions for use. Route or method of application, urodynamic use. This is to be used in the ureter, for example, or orally. Any preparation necessary for use. It doesn't need to be excuse me, refrigerated or mixed or something to that effect. There are exemptions from adequate directions for use, and a prescription device is exempt from adequate directions for use, which means that if you sell a device to a physician, you don't have to meet the requirements for adequate directions for use. And to summarize this slide, you have to have the second bullet point, caution, federal restricts this device to sell by, etc., etc. That must be on your labeling. That it shows the FDA and the end user that your device is a prescription device and is exempt from adequate directions for use. Certain statements have to be prominent, and those statements that require such prominence is lacking in the following circumstance. If the statement is not on the labeling, that the part that's normally displayed under normal conditions, if it's stocked on the shelf of a pharmacy, for example, and it's on the bottom left-hand corner in 2-size font, that's not prominent enough. If the package contains sufficient space, but the required information does not appear on 2 or more panels, then that statement is not prominently displayed enough. Failure to extend required labeling over the package space. You must take up the entire panel if you're required to do so. If there is lack of sufficient space for the required labeling due to non-required labeling on the package, maybe trade puffery, a good example. This is wonderful, brand new thing, best on the market. Meanwhile, your address isn't there because it's overcrowded. Insufficient prominence is also when the smallness or style of type, there's an insufficient contrast between the labeling and the background. If they're both white, for example, or one's white and one's a bone type color, or there's a design that obscures labeling, in those cases, that statement is not featured prominently enough. There's an exemption, however, from this requirement, and an exemption is that if the device labeling lacks sufficient space for required labeling, you're exempt from it as long as the existing label space is not taken up by any sort of trade puffery or non-required information, and the existing label space is not used for representations in a foreign language. The FDA requires that all labeling must be in English unless distribution is solely within Puerto Rico or U.S. territory where the dominant language is not English. Good luck proving that your distribution is solely within Puerto Rico or U.S. territory where the dominant language is not English, in which case you don't sell to any of the 50 states. I guess in a situation where you can prove this, you can prove perhaps historically that you've only ever sold to Puerto Rico, then that's going to be okay for you. However, in that circumstance, if any information appears in a foreign language, then all required labeling must also appear in that language. So this doesn't get you outside of the labeling requirement, it gets you outside of the language requirement. There are other exemptions. Retail exemption is one. When a device is delivered to the end user by a physician, he hands it right to the end user. In a case like this, the labeling only has to have the name and address of the practitioner, of the physician, directions for use, and any required cautionary statements. Commonly known directions. If adequate directions for use are known to the layman, then that's fine. For example, while ibuprofen has to contain identity and required dosage and things like that, it doesn't need to say, take the caplet and put it in your mouth. It doesn't need to say that. In vitro diagnostics, they have their own labeling requirements that I'm not going to cover in this presentation, other than to say that they are exempt from labeling requirements generally, but they do need to meet the in vitro diagnostic labeling requirements. Devices used in manufacturing are also exempt from these requirements. If they're used in processing, repacking, or manufacturing of another device, they've got to have the statement that says, caution for manufacturing, processing, or repacking, and then they're covered. Any devices that are used in teaching, research, or law enforcement are also exempt from this regulation. In this case, the device is shipped or sold or given to anybody lawfully engaged in instruction, in pharmacy, perhaps pharmacy school, or chemistry or medicine, as long as there's not clinical use here. Devices can be given to medical schools for in vitro evaluations or in vitro testing, education, things like that, or law enforcement. Exemptions from labeling requirements are if there's an in-process device that's in transit from one manufacturing site to another, as long as the sites have the same ownership, that device does not need to meet the labeling requirements. Also, if delivery is made under a written agreement, which includes details describing further processing, the classic thing here is sterilization. When we send our product to be sterilized to our sterilizer, and then they turn around and send it back, that product that we've shipped to them and that they've sent back does not need to meet all of the labeling requirements because there is a written agreement. I've given the same example here on sterile devices. Section 801-150 talks about this in much more detail. Over-the-counter devices do have their own peculiar labeling requirements. The first part of the reg references the principal display panel, and this is the portion of the label that's intended to be displayed. Any of you who work at companies who make over-the-counter devices know what this is, and if you ever go to the pharmacy, you see that there's a particular side of the label that is clearly meant to face you as you walk down the aisle. The area of the principal display panel, for rectangular package, cylindrical package, and other shape, there are regulations, there are requirements that must be met, and these are them. It's very specific because from the FDA's perspective, when you're writing to the layperson, the FDA wants to protect the layperson since there's no shield, if you will, between the device manufacturer and the patient, such as there is with prescription devices. Statement of identity must be listed on the principal display panel. It's got to list the common name of the device, what it's intended to do, any indications for use must be in there, how to use it. It must be in bold type and of a comparable size to the most prominent printed matter. and it has to be parallel to the base of the package on which it rests. Again, extensive requirements for over-the-counter devices because the FDA knows that its primary responsibility is to protect the public. What's in it? And this is always something that if you do over-the-counter devices, you wrestle with quite often. The net quantity of contents in many devices is, maybe it's in quantity, how many pills are in there. It might be measure. It could be numerical count, some sort of combination. So from a quantity perspective, how many are in there? From a measure perspective, liquid measure, gallons, quarts, pints, ounces, whatever is most applicable. And from a weight perspective, pounds or ounces. Where does the quantity of contents statement have to be? It's got to be separately on each principal display panel. It has to be separated. I mean, these requirements are incredible. It has to be separated by at least a space equal to the height of the lettering from all the other information. Again, the FDA, one could say, goes overboard, but on the other hand, you could look at it as they're doing every single thing they can to protect the patients. You know, the size of the space that has to be separated from the other areas within the specific bottom percentage. That there's quite a bit here. Back to the QSR labeling. The quality system regulation put out by the FDA has certain labeling requirements, and your quality system has to assure that your labeling meets all of your device master directive requirements: legibility, adhesion, can it stick, etc. Your labeling operations must be controlled so that the correct labeling is issued and used. Now remember that labeling includes equipment labels, package labels, directions for use, control labels, maintenance manuals, all sorts of these things. Your quality system must be sure that the correct labeling is issued and used, and you have to be able to verify that and prove that. 820A2 talks about approval or rejection of packaging materials and labeling. You must have a system in place by which you inspect your packaging materials, whether you purchase them from out of house or print them on demand. Your 82040 talks about your facilities, and one of the areas it mentions is that your building must be of suitable design and have sufficient space for, and a list of a few other things. But one of the things it specifically references is labeling operations. So you need to show that your facility has adequate space for design and space for labeling. 82120 talks about legibility. Not just legibility when it's printed, but legibility when it's normal conditions of use over the expected life of the device. So as part of your shelf life validation, if you have a consumable, in the case I'm talking about here, you need to show that after 3 or 5 years, the labeling is still legible. You also must have requirements, have procedures, and pass-fail criteria for inspection, handling, storage, and distribution of your labeling. And the FDA considers that your device is adulterated if all of these requirements are not met. Shifting gears a little, talking about labeling specifications. What's on your labeling? How big does it have to be? This is all going to be specified in your device master record. And each of your labels must have an engineering drawing or artwork. It must specify what the label is made out of. It could just say paper, that's fine. Sometimes labeling is pre-printed onto a sterile pouch, for example. Dimensions, what's the size? What's the ink color? Things like that. What are your inspection and control procedures? How do you inspect labeling? And how do you control your labeling if you pre-print it and store it and issue it with jobs? If applicable, you need to have a procedure for attaching the labeling. Now, many firms still have stickers, I'll call them, that they stick onto their product, and that's fine. And what your procedure doesn't need to say, peel off the back, put the sticker on it. What your procedure or document, it could be a drawing, needs to have is, where does it go? How far from each corner or each end is supposed to go? This is hugely critical when you're putting your labeling on the Tyvek side of a product that's going to be sterilized, because if you misplace the labeling or it's done in a specific in the incorrect area, or if it's supposed to go on the transparent side and it goes on the Tyvek side, this could affect adversely affect your sterilization. In cases where your labeling is purchased as a component, the specifications should be contained on purchase specifications. Artwork alone will not fulfill the DMR requirements for labeling. It's not acceptable if you purchase labeling as a label as a component that it just has what's on the labeling. You need to have size, you need to have a company from which you purchase it, it needs to be under change control, what color it needs to be, areas such as that. Your labeling has to be verified or validated to show that it's going to stay attached. Now this is a no-brainer if you print directly onto your pouch or if you etch onto your instrument, but in many cases that's not done. In many cases it's done by adhesion. And in these cases you have to make sure that you have to show in advance as part of a verification and validation that your labeling is going to remain attached and legible during all its normal processing, handling, distribution, etc. And your labeling specifications must have who prepared the label, it must have an approval signature that somebody has inspected the labeling, and it must have the date that approval was done. So those are requirements, but now what we have is, what I want to present to you is the sequence of label and control. How the label control goes all the way from the beginning to the end when the label is issued. The first thing that's done to labeling is it's developed, and labeling is developed under a design review. It can't just be issued by a particular department. There must be an interdepartmental design review to review the development of labeling. Then the labeling is once the text and the size, etc., is done, the labeling is going to be evaluated. There might be a verification or validation test, simulated or actual processing, shipping tests, shelf life, things like that. Then the labeling is documented. At this point, you know what the labeling is going to read, you know what its characteristics are going to be, and you know that it's going to work. It's going to stay adhered and legible. That's when you approve it via date and change control. All labeling must be change controlled. I recommend that you put a file sample, either a copy of an actual label or the artwork, in your device master record. Procurement, you want to make sure that before your labeling is released to stock, it's verified. Labeling storage, after all this is done, your labeling is going to be stored. And your goal in storing labeling, if this is applicable to you, of course, is you want to make sure that labels are stored to prevent mix-ups and also stored to restrict access. Make sure also, when it comes to storage, there could be electronic storage. You want to make sure that only the people who need to have write access have write access. Everyone else has read access or print access. Make sure that you separate the operations. Make sure you separate, all the operations have to be separated to prevent mix-ups. Area inspection is a critical area, if you will, when it comes to label control. Before a labeling operation is begun, and each area must be inspected and make sure that any unrelated items, any previous labels, any previously rejected labels have to be removed to avoid possible inconsistencies. Line clearance is the term that's often used for this. When it comes to labeling issuance, the labeling as it's applied should be examined for identity, control number, expiration date. The people who are applying the labeling see every label. You probably are going to have a post-processing sample inspection by a QA department after this, but that's just a sampling. Make sure that you're part of the training of your production personnel or the personnel who attach the labeling is that it's their responsibility to look at the labeling as they actually apply it. Switching gears to general labeling requirements. Labeling has to be designed and applied so that it has to remain in place and be legible during distribution, storage, and use. From a design perspective, as I said before, you've got to validate and verify this. And it has to be, and when it's applied, make sure it's as part of routine production, it undergoes an inspection. Labeling, receipt, and inspection is an area that you need to stay on top of also. There's going to be, when it gets to labeling, there are areas that are often overlooked. In my experience, this is one of them. Upon receipt, all labeling, including any pre-printed containers, any package inserts, things like that, have to make sure that they conform to your specifications. Samples must be proofread. After acceptance, labeling can be placed into inventory or just handed right to production. As long as it's inspected, it doesn't matter where it goes. Inspections should be recorded into the DHR to show that inspecting and the proofreading were performed. You need to show acceptance of this labeling, and the way to do that is by documenting that in the DHR. Your inspection record should be kept simple. Initial, date, quantity, that's good enough. Area separation is very important. Line clearance, as I said before. You can't have any mix-ups between similar labeling. Some labeling is obvious. It's 3 times the size of our previous labeling. Other labeling, especially if you have an extended product line of a particular type of device, it might be less clear. You know, the labeling might be much more similar. Your separation has to be physical, spatial, if you will. The way you want to do this is make sure that you perform labeling at different times for different devices. This just increases the likelihood of no mix-up. Separation isn't required when mix-ups aren't possible. For example, if you stock labeled front panels that fit only one family of instruments, there's not going to be a problem that they can't fit anywhere else. So when it comes to area separation, it's not critical that you practice that. The way to determine how stringent your production area controls are going to be, or should be, is based on how likely is the labeling mix-up. Really speaking, specifically speaking, your labeling control doesn't need to be that stringent if you only make dissimilar labeling. If all of your labels are dissimilar size, texture, materials, then it's not that critical that your area separation practices are perfect. But in the circumstances whether or not, before you begin your labeling, thoroughly examine the production area to make sure that it's clear. Make certain that any labeling materials remaining have been removed. Make sure that you include in your evaluation, your examination of the surrounding areas, all surrounding areas, tables, packaging lines, printing machines. You'd be surprised how often people overlook the table next to them for their evaluation of area separation. Any unused labeling that contains production information. Perhaps you're going to make 1,000 of these consumables with lot number 123, and your common practice, or that label control made a mistake. They issued too many labels. So you have 5 extra labels that say lot number 123. Don't return that to storage. Tear those up because they contain production information that should not be available. When labeling is issued, it's got to be verified to make sure it complies with the DMR. Control numbers, expiration date. So this is not incoming inspection. This is issuance to production, because you don't want to print your control numbers or expiration dates before you have to. This inspection, in addition to the previous inspection, must be documented in the DHR for that particular lot. When it comes to expiration dates, the expiration date is after it reflects the time after the final packaging that the device is still fit for the intended use. If you're going to put a 3-year expiration date or a 5-year expiration date, you must have test data that supports this claim. You are misbranding your device. Again, if you write a 3-year shelf life and you have no data supporting that, your device is misbranded. It has inaccurate information on it. If it's just impossible for mix-ups to occur, the original inspection is going to be good enough, so you don't need to do a label check and record in that particular case. Sterile device labeling, just a quick mention here. When the device is not sterile in its entirety, make sure your labeling says fluid path sterile, not just sterile. If your device is not meant to be re-sterilized or isn't validated for re-sterilization or processing, it's got to say single use only. Device labeled non-pyrogenic, usually blood contact devices are labeled non-pyrogenic. They have to be tested each sterilization run. It's not, or more often, it's not acceptable that you test it once a year with your annual sterilization validation. Consider non-pyrogenic as lot release, if you will. If there are any instructions necessary on opening or sterile packaging for the end user, make sure those are included in the in the in the labeling, in the in the instructions for use themselves. When it comes to labeling changes, all changes must be made under your normal change control system, just as when you change specifications. All changes must be reviewed and authorized before implementation internally. Externally, when it comes to whether you need to let the FDA know, I've given you a citation here to a 510K memorandum that's dated 1997, but it's still in very common use in the industry. And what this is it tells you what type of change do you have to your device and whether you need to inform the FDA. This is a barely legible, but I've taken it from the website, flowchart, which tells you there are other flowcharts. Is it a design change, et cetera, things like that? Is it a manufacturing change? This talks about, is it a labeling change? And as you can see, you go down the flowchart to determine what type of change you have. And the next several slides will cover each of these decision trees. So as you can see, A1, does the change affect the indications for use? If it does, a 510K is required. And the definition in this case of indications for use is the target population that is going to be used, that this device is going to be used on. The exception here is that if you're going to change your indications for use and it limits use within a currently cleared indication, that's going to be okay. The example here is that if you have your device accepted for general use for anybody, and now you're going to change that to pediatric use only, you do not need to require you do not need a 510K, because that change is a subset, is now limiting to a subset of the currently approved device. Examples of labeling changes that do impact intended use. Now you had a single-use only device, and now you're going to label it for reuse of that device. You had a prescription device, and now it's going to be over-the-counter device. Those are two situations in which you do need to file a 510K. A2, change in warnings and precautions. In this case, a 510K is not required. A warning is an alert about a situation, that if it's not avoided, it could result in death or serious injury. If you're changing your warning, then that's okay. You don't need to inform the FDA. Similarly, if you're changing your precaution, it's sort of an alert that if you don't avoid it, it could result in minor or moderate injury to the user or patient or damage to the equipment. In these particular cases, a 510K is not required. A3, if you add a contraindication, what it says here, as you can see, new 510K change being affected. And what that means, a contraindication, just as an aside, is when the device shouldn't be used. And if you're going to add a contraindication, the FDA does allow you to continue to market your device with the modified labeling, but you're going to then submit a 510K, because again, what it says here is new 510K change being affected, which is different than 510K required. A4, if you're going to delete a contraindication, what this does is, it typically, when you delete a contraindication, this shouldn't be used in the following circumstance. That's a contraindication. What this does is it expands the indications for use. An example that I've seen in the literature is if a physical restraint that you sell was contraindicated for use for people weighing less than 100 pounds because it might not hold them, and you're going to remove that indication, now you're expanding the indications for use. You need to submit a 510K for that particular device. And lastly, is the labeling being revised for clarity to ensure safer or more effective use? If it is, no 510K is required. What you're doing here is your firm realizes that you want to make the device easier or safer or more effective to use, or just, there's something you want to clarify. The FDA doesn't want you to stop doing that. Submit a 510K, then go ahead, wait 90 days. They want people and end users to know that your device should be used in a safer manner immediately. Just want to cover, even though the coverage focusing more on FDA, I do want to just cover the CE implications for just a minute here. From the medical device perspective, if your device has a CE on it, you're MDD certified, and your labeling has to contain name and address, your authorized representative within the European community, identification contents, sterile lot, or serial number, expiration date, indications for single use if that's applicable. If you are are using this exclusively for clinical investigations and you want your device to be CE marked, the Medical Device Directive requires that you state that. Storage and handling conditions, operating instructions, warning and or precautions. You'll have to select which of those is applicable. For active devices, which are electronic devices for the most part, year of manufacturer, or it could be a smart number on the actual instrument itself as part of the serial number. If the expiration date is not applicable, the year of manufacture will take precedence. And method of sterilization. You can see, looking at this list, that the overwhelming majority of these are also mimicked in the FDA. So if you're a company who has a device that is FDA cleared or FDA approved if it's Class 3, and you're considering getting the product CE marked, you have very little additional hoops that you need to jump through. Do want to cover this for a second. There is a European standard that is titled Symbols for Use in the Labeling of Medical Devices, and I've included a few here. Do not use if package is damaged is that particular picture. Warning, do not reuse, a 2 with a line through it. Date of manufacture and manufacturer, a little different, so you don't need to write manufactured by LifeTech or company. You would just put this icon and you just write LifeTech after it. Use by date is that hourglass, that almost half-filled hourglass. Instead of expiration date, you just put that and the date after that. Now, having said all of this about these symbols, let me tell you one thing. The FDA hates these. They do not condone their use. If you have a CE marked device and you, instead of if you have a device that's single use, and instead of writing single use only, you put this 2 through the icon with the icon of the 2 with the line through it, your device will be judged by the FDA to be misbranded, and you will get into a lot of trouble. The FDA, for now at least, is insisting on remaining separate. They've always done this, actually, from the European community. Although in these days of trying to work together, there's a chance that they may embrace these icons, but it's probably a little ways off. There are some future labeling implications. The first one is a barcode. The current USA accepted format is considered HIBC, and the European accepted format is GS1. That's a little different. Little dated here, I apologize. So it was anticipated that the FDA was going to publish their final regs in June 2009. This has not happened, and it's let me see the best way to put this. I would say tabled for now. There's no date by which they're expected to publish their final regs. Preliminary regs have included the use of GS1 standards, a slight difference there, but they are still months and months away. When it comes to PVC, there is currently no requirement to identify PVC on labeling from a national perspective. However, effective March 2010, it will be a requirement to identify phthalate content in PVC. For example, many plastics are made up of DEHP. And effective March 2010, if you want to sell in Europe, your devices are going to have this indication on them. Now, that's different. It doesn't have to not contain PVC, but it has to be identified if it does. And this is going to be done with symbols and text, just like much of the European regulations are. And it's currently under development. So, in summary, labeling is just a lot of different things. I mean, I'll read the graph, of course, but labeling is just a lot of different things. Anything that goes with a device or can go with a device is on the device, near the device, and the FDA interprets this to be as large as possible. They have a very liberal interpretation of what constitutes labeling. My advice to you as attendees of this webinar is that what you bring back to your company is that you need to have that same type of liberal position on what constitutes labeling. If you're not sure, it is labeling. All written, printed, graphic matter on the device, on its container, on a wrapper, accompanying device, even something that's going to end up with the device but isn't currently accompanying it. Any labeling error you have, that means that your device is misbranded. If it's discovered during the FDA inspection, the chances are real good or bad, depending on where you're sitting, that you're going to get a warning letter on that. The regulations set forth all the required contents, and what I want you to take out of here is that they don't forbid just blatant lies, which is obvious, but any sort of misrepresentation, misleading statement, anything that they find objectionable, make sure you stick to facts. That's why when sales develops your labeling, or even your promotional material, advertising material, make sure everything, any claim that they make with regard to specifics is able to be objectively verified. Like I said, over-the-counter devices have additional very, very specific requirements. The FDA is all about consumer protection. Labeling control is best handled in the documented sequence that I presented here. Anytime you change your labels, make sure your changed labels are controlled under your normal change control system, just like every other procedure, every other document. Your labeling is a component, and it should have a component part number, and that component part number should be change controlled. Any labeling change must be evaluated with regard to regulatory submission. I gave you the website here and gave you a admittedly brief explanation of what it means, what the interpretation by the FDA is, and make sure that when you evaluate that, if you decide not to inform the FDA as part of your ECO, or engineering change order, or DCO, document control order, that you have your regulatory person or someone else put in there why the FDA is not being performed. Per decision tree, flowchart A, decision A3, we determine that this merely, and explain what it is and say, therefore, we're not required to inform FDA. There are CE implications. Make sure if you're going to sell your device into Europe, or are selling your device into Europe, you take those into account. And just as a summary, 21 CFR 801.1 and the Medical Device Directive Annex 1 that clauses 13.3 to 13.6 include the regulations when it comes to labeling. So what we'll do now is we will go ahead and begin to accept questions, and I'll turn control back to David, who will solicit the questions.
Jeff, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, and I want to thank all the participants for cooperating with us. It is time now for the Q&A to begin, and I request to the participants to use the Q&A panel to type in their questions or use the raise hand feature.
Okay, I have 2 questions. First question reads, if the FDA does not like the symbols, but the EU does, do you need separate labels for internationally sold products? How can you comply with both using the same single label? Your single label, it's up to you. Either you have a product that you ship internationally and it meets those requirements, or products that you ship domestically and it meets those requirements. In practice, I've not seen that done. What we do here and what I've seen done is the label contains both. For example, the label says single use only, and it has the 2 with the circle around it and the line through it. So you can comply with both using single label as long as both sets of requirements are met on that label. Next question. If a single customer has a new unique use for an established product, for example, including it in a kit, is the supplier or manufacturer of the product responsible for changing the labeling if it is not intended use? No. In that case, you sell your component. Let's say it's a syringe that you use for cardiovascular use, and you know that when you sell that syringe, it's going to be included in a kit by another medical device company that's going to be used for anesthesia use. It is not your responsibility. In that particular case, your end user is the other medical device company, so you are not required to change the labeling. It's not your intended use. Wow, next question. Can you recommend a vendor or company that can produce or write FDA-compliant labels for devices? Unfortunately, I cannot do that, not because I'm not at liberty to discuss this, but I actually don't know a company that will do that. There are many consulting companies that will come in and consult with you and find out what your intended use is. I do know that ClobalCompliancePanel, the company that is giving this webinar, does also do on-site consulting. So I recommend this particular case that instead of the way you handle this, if you want to take this, if you want to outsource this, is by contacting a firm, again, such as Compliance Panel, and there are many others, and have a consultant come in and evaluate your labels.
Jeff, I've sent you a question through chat.
Okay.
It says
Okay,
if we have
here's the question. If we have single use only in a CE marked label, we need to translate it in different languages. How do you handle this? Well, that's not correct. The single use only is, the CE requirement for single use only is the circle 2 with the line through it. That means that that icon is understood in every European Community country.
Are there any other questions from anyone else? Or I'll just wait for a couple of minutes if any more questions. If you could, the raise hand button is right under the participants panel. If you could use that button, I could go ahead and unmute you and you may ask your questions. Meanwhile, I've just opened the feedback. I request you just give me a moment. Ms. Prema.
Oh, hi. If you have, this was about the single-use only question that I had asked previously. So if you have the 2 with the cross and the single-use only, both on the label, the way the European countries ask is, if you have anything in English, that needs to be translated. So if you have both there, we need to translate the we need to do something about that written phrase, right, the single use only. So will it be okay if you just use the 2 with the cross, if you just use the symbol instead of the wording?
Yes, if you're only going to sell in the European Community, you're only required to use the icon, the 2 circle 2 with the line through it.
But if you need to sell it in both, in US and Europe?
In that case, the European Community will accept it because in their position, the translation for single use only is the icon.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Jeff, there's another question from Ms. Lena on the Q&A panel.
I don't see it.
If an international distributor states in writing that English only labeling is okay, does he exempt the supplier manufacturer from translating?
I'm still looking for that.
I'll read it for you, Jeff. If an international distributor states in writing that English only labeling is okay, does that exempt the supplier manufacturer from translating?
It only exempts you if your international distributor is going to do the translation themselves before they sell it. If that's not the case, if you're going to sell to your distributor and they're just going to take what you have and put it on the market, you're violating the international regulations. And your international distributor, who's a private company, cannot authorize that legally. So the answer is no.
There's another question. For capital equipment, maintenance and installation manuals are considered labeling correct?
Yes.
To remanufactured or as maintained equipment?
Let me see if I understand this. So I'm assuming that in the case where it's the same company who is both, they're refurbishing, I guess would be the best word. In that case, yes, it does extend to that remanufactured as maintained equipment.
All right, and Rich, I hope that answers your question. Or is anybody any more questions?
Yeah, I have one more.
Yes.
When you have multiple levels of labeling, say you have one for the box, one for the tray, and do we need to have all these requirements in each of the labels? Like
no, it only needs to be on one of the labels. However, for example, your company name does need to be on. The best way to look at this is that it needs to be on the amount of product that will either be stocked or used. So if you sell your trays in a box of 10, it's going to be on the outside of that box. However, the facility is almost certainly going to stock those trays in single units on the shelf. So it needs to be on the trays as well.
Okay. Oh, so
Right.
you're thinking more from the point of traceability. Like if somebody picks up a box, they should be
Yes,
able to trace it either way, like whether it is a box or a tray.
that is correct.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And I have one more question.
Sure.
You talked about, when you talked about the sterile device labeling, you said that the instructions on opening the sterile packaging, to avoid contamination, is that mandatory?
No, it's not. It's something that, it's just a point of consideration that some pouches are very obvious. Others not so much so. I've seen them both ways. Because since you're selling a sterile device, if you're certain that it's going to be used by a medical professional, you probably don't need to do it. It's something to be more seriously considered if you sell to over-the-counter stuff. So it's just a point of consideration, not so much a requirement.
Okay. And one last question. When it comes to, that there is an RX only, which, it should be used by a medical professional. Instead of that, can you substitute by RX only, or?
Not as far as the FDA is concerned.
No.
The FDA requires that you include the wording that I included earlier in the presentation.
Oh, okay.
Must be sold to by or in the order of a physician. So I'm very close, but it's close to that.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I have a question I might need some clarification on. The question reads, any general comments on electronic submissions for medical device and that status and plan forward? I'm trying to read sort of a labeling spin into this question. So if the individual who sent it could either verbally or in writing sort of give me a clue of what you're looking for, I'll definitely answer that question.
Are there any more questions? And for any reason, if you were unable to ask your questions, doubts, I request you to please share it with me, your host, by chat, and I shall get the answer from our presenter. And meanwhile, we simply request you share your feedback in the feedback form that is on your screen now.
Actually, we have somebody who asked a question, how do we open the line to ask a question? So I think that there is another verbal question that someone's having trouble figuring out how to open their line. So if you could let them know how to do that.
Yeah. Richard? Mr. Becker? You may ask a question.
Oh, the line's open?
Yes, I hear you now.
Oh, okay, sorry. This is Rich. I was asking about electronic submissions. So on the pharma side, that was required some time ago, but on med device for labeling, is there a requirement to electronically submit labeling content?
No, for right now, when it comes to submissions, there's no electronic requirement yet. That's still something it's an option at this point, so it's not a requirement. And the electronic submission for med devices is, in a non-writable, non-changeable format. So when it would come to labeling on that, it would just be your standard PDF.
Okay.
Well, if any of the other attendees have any more questions, I request you to use the raise hand feature, and I shall unmute you, and you may ask a question. All right, Jeff, I don't think there are any more questions.
Hello?
Right.
I heard something.
Hi. Hello?
Yes.
Hello, yes.
Regarding barcodes, if we have a product that it is manufactured in Europe, it has to have the U.S. code, the IIBC. I guess if it only has the European code, it will be misbranded in the U.S.?
No, that's not in place yet. There's no. Let me try to put this better. There is currently no regulatory requirement by the FDA for barcode accuracy or inaccuracy. Those are just sort of the barcode concept is more Department of Commerce than it is FDA. So nothing will be in error. The only problem you would have would be that if the facility to which you sell has a barcodes machine that does not understand the European barcoding, I mean, doesn't understand the European barcoding, then that would be an issue. But it's more of a business issue than it is a regulatory issue.
Okay, so it's just for commercial purposes.
That is correct.
Okay. Okay. The other question that I have is regarding the different language on the labeling. So again, in the same situation, we have a product that is manufactured in a foreign country and is also distributed in the United States. And is it possible that, provided that we have already established on the labeling the manufacturing and the distributor address, is it possible to add another distributor address that is not in the U.S.?
Yes, you can certainly do that.
Okay. Okay. All right. And the last question is, what will be the additional roles and responsibilities of a U.S. distributor of a product that is manufactured in a foreign country? The foreign country has all the change controls in place for labeling. The distributor participates in proofreading the labeling and ensuring that it does comply with the U.S. regulations and guidelines. Is there any other obligations for the distributor in Europe?
No, there are no additional ones, and that's actually even more than the distributor is required to do. But certainly, always doing more is better than always doing less. But no, there are no more requirements than that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And Mr. Belen Casnida, do you have any questions? I've unmuted everyone, so when anyone has a question, you may go ahead and ask the questions. Yes, Ms. Prema.
Oh, hi. When it comes to the manufacturer, right, the person who is holding the 510K is the manufacturer. Is that correct?
Yes, the FDA looks at that, and they also look at whose name appears on the labeling.
Yeah. So the person's should the person who is holding, like we talked about the manufactured for, distributed by, and all those things.
Mm-hmm.
So in all those different scenarios, who is the legal manufacturer? Is that the person who holds the 510K or the person who is distributing it?
It's the person whose name appears on the label as manufacturer, because it is possible to legally transfer ownership of a 510K.
Oh, okay. That's in the contract.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's on the labeling, and if it says if it just has the company's name, they are the manufacturer. If it says manufactured for,
mm-hmm.
then the company who does the manufacturing is the manufacturer, the other company, not the company for. Is that clear?
So the company who like say if an OEM is manufacturing it for a certain company, then the OEM is the manufacturer, not the company it is being manufactured for. Is that
correct? Correct.
Okay. Thanks.
You're welcome.
All right, the lines are still open. If anyone wants to ask you questions, can go ahead. In the meantime, I would like to thank everyone for participating in this webinar. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can send us an email at webinars@compliancepanel.com, or if any of you feel that you or your team members and colleagues, friends would benefit from this webinar, we're happy to inform you that it will be available in the recorded format and can be purchased from our website, or you can call us at 714-441-5856. We welcome your suggestions and feedbacks or ideas on how to improve our webinars. If you'd like to suggest a topic or desire a customized corporate training, online or on-site, we ensure that whatever your training necessity, it will be a priority. All right, we look forward to having you again soon sometime and for your continued patronage. Thank you all once again and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
And And Jeff, do you see another question?
I don't see any. I'm still looking, and I don't see any further questions. Chat.
One of the physical for product that is manufactured for, do you then need two manufacturer addresses, one for the physical manufacturer, one for the private label manufacturer?
Is that, I'm sorry, I'm trying to, if I could read it, it would be great. I'm trying to, let's see, participants, no, chat, Q&A.
Just give me, I just sent it to you in the chat, Jeff.
Okay, that'll work. That'd be great. Okay, there it is. For product that is manufactured for, do you then need two manufacturer addresses, one for physical manufacturer, one for private manufacturer? No. If product is manufactured for, it's the option of the two companies to have the label either say manufactured for or manufactured by. So both are not required, only one is.
Right, and Lena, I hope that your question's answered. I think Jeff, they have left us, right?
I'm still here.